Some women don't chase, and yet, they're never forgotten. They move through the world like the quiet after a storm, not loud, not desperate, but charged with the kind of silence that makes a man question who he is when she looks at him. She doesn't ask for attention. She simply exists, and somehow, that's enough to stir the oldest ache inside him, the one he never learned to name. He doesn't understand it, not at first. He only knows that her presence feels familiar, like something he's seen in dreams he couldn't remember upon waking. She speaks little, smiles rarely, and when she does, it's never to please. It's the smile of a woman who has seen her own shadow and didn't flinch. To a man still ruled by his ego, that kind of woman is both wonder and threat. Because she doesn't mirror his illusions, she mirrors his truth. And the truth is never easy to love. When she meets his gaze, something ancient stirs in him, a silent trembling behind the armor. His carefully constructed self-image, the confident, rational, composed man, begins to flicker. She doesn't fight him, doesn't chase, doesn't explain. She simply sees. And in that seeing, he feels the edges of his identity start to blur. He mistakes that for love. But it's not love. It's recognition. She is the living embodiment of his anima, the inner feminine he repressed, neglected, romanticized, and feared. In her eyes, he meets all that he abandoned within himself: tenderness, chaos, depth, vulnerability. She becomes his mirror, and mirrors, by nature, do not lie. But mirrors also do not bend. The moment he realizes she won't shape herself around his projections is the moment he begins to break. Because to lose control of her is to lose control of the fantasy he built to avoid himself. And as he watches her, calm, distant, sovereign, he feels the terrifying pull between desire and dissolution. He wants her light, but not the reflection it forces him to see. That's when the unraveling begins. Not in her, but in him. Because the woman who mirrors truth always becomes the man's breaking point. She entered his life not as a storm, but as a stillness. The kind of stillness that made noise uncomfortable, that made him notice his own restlessness. She did not demand to be seen, and perhaps that is why he saw her. In a room filled with voices, she was the pause between words. He felt drawn, not by her beauty, but by her being. Her energy carried something both ancient and unsettling, a calm that could not be conquered. She did not flirt, nor did she retreat. She simply was. And that beingness, that effortless presence, reflected to him all the ways he was not. When a man meets a woman who embodies her essence, something deep within him stirs, an awakening he mistakes for attraction. But it is not her lips or her laughter he craves. It is the mirror she unknowingly holds before him. Carl Jung once wrote that every man carries within him an image of woman, an inner feminine called the anima. She is his soul's reflection, tender, intuitive, emotional, all that his ego cannot contain. And when he meets a woman who resembles that image, his unconscious begins to awaken. He projects his inner world upon her, mistaking her for salvation. To him, she becomes everything he believes he lacks. He sees her as the answer to loneliness, to emptiness, to meaning. But what he truly seeks is not her, it is himself, reflected through her presence. And yet, he cannot see that. So he calls it destiny. He calls it chemistry. He calls it love. But the truth is simpler and crueler. She mirrors his unlived life, the tenderness he abandoned, the softness he buried under armor, the vulnerability he learned to shame. Her independence calls out to the parts of him that crave freedom. Her silence calls out to the noise within him that never stops. He begins to orbit her, unconsciously, his attention circling her gravity like a moth around a flame. Her calmness makes him uneasy. Her confidence makes him defensive. He cannot understand why her lack of need feels like rejection. He tries to provoke her, with distance, with words, with silence of his own. But she doesn't chase. She doesn't beg to be understood. And that unsettles him more than any argument could. Because deep down, he wants to be needed. He wants to be the savior, the hero, the center of her emotional universe. He wants the feminine to revolve around him, not realizing that his need for control is a symptom of his disconnection from his own feminine nature. She feels his push and pull, the invisible tug of his projection. She senses the flickering between admiration and resentment, the way he watches her, both in awe and in defense. She knows this pattern, though she cannot always explain it. She has lived it before, men who fall in love not with her, but with what she reflects. And still, she remains composed. Her calm is not indifference, it is knowing. Knowing that when a man is confronted with a woman who mirrors his unconscious, he will either awaken or destroy what he sees. He will call her mysterious when she is simply grounded. He will call her cold when she is simply self-possessed. He will call her unattainable when he has yet to attain himself. Because the mirror is merciless. When he looks into her eyes, he sees not her, but the reflection of his own disconnection. And for a man who has never met his shadow, that reflection feels unbearable. He begins to project onto her all that he denies within himself. His suppressed tenderness becomes her weakness. His unhealed wounds become her mystery. His longing becomes her power. And as the mirror sharpens, so does his confusion. In his dreams, he sees her, not as she is, but as he wishes her to be, pliant, comforting, endlessly understanding. He builds an image of her in his mind, one that does not exist. And slowly he stops seeing the woman before him at all. He sees only his anima, his idealized reflection of the feminine. She senses the shift, the way his admiration turns to expectation, the way his tenderness hides control, the way his words begin to tighten, as if trying to contain her. There are moments he looks at her with awe, and moments he looks at her with quiet resentment, as if blaming her for the emotions she awakens in him. He wants to own the reflection, not realizing that it was never hers to give. The tension between them becomes sacred, electric, and unbearable. The air between their words thickens with meaning. Every silence carries weight. Every look becomes a test. And though he does not speak it, he feels it, the deep, primal knowing that she sees through him. That she perceives not just his words, but his wounding. Not just his charm, but his shadow. Her gaze cuts through the ego he so carefully built. It strips away the armor he wears for the world, the confident posture, the rehearsed composure. In her presence, he feels seen in a way that terrifies him. Because to be truly seen is to be vulnerable. And vulnerability feels like death to the man who has built his identity on control. He begins to oscillate between obsession and withdrawal, the dance of a man caught between love and fear. One moment he wants to merge with her completely. The next, he needs to escape her light. In Jungian terms, he is facing his shadow. Everything he denied within himself, every weakness, every fear, every wound, now stands before him in the form of a woman who refuses to play small. And she, unknowingly, becomes the stage where his unconscious drama unfolds. He will worship her one moment and reject her the next. He will confess his love and then disappear. He will build her up as divine and then tear her down as dangerous. Because every projection demands its opposite. The more light he assigns to her, the darker his shadow grows. But she has learned this pattern, the sacred cycle of projection and withdrawal. She has seen men fall in love with her light, only to crumble when they encounter their reflection. So she stays centered. She does not take his chaos personally. She knows it is not her he is fighting, it is himself. Her silence becomes his mirror. Her detachment becomes his confrontation. She is not punishing him. She is showing him himself. The mirror never lies, and so it is rarely loved. He will call her distant, unfeeling, impossible to read, not realizing that she simply stopped performing the emotional labor of his projections. And in that quiet resistance, she becomes his greatest teacher. The one who reveals that love without awareness is merely longing. Still, he cannot name the lesson. Not yet. His ego is still too loud, his fear too raw. He mistakes the reflection for rejection. He mistakes her boundaries for walls. But something in him begins to tremble, not in anger, but in recognition. For the first time, he begins to see himself reflected back, not through flattery or fantasy, but through truth. And though he will not admit it, that truth begins to change him. It seeps into his dreams, his thoughts, his moments alone. He begins to notice how often he speaks to impress, how often he performs confidence instead of living it. He notices how much he fears silence, how much he avoids his own company. Her presence becomes a haunting reminder that there is more within him than he dares to face. And as he stares into her mirror, the question begins to echo. Is it her he loves, or the part of himself he lost? It begins quietly, not with an argument, not with betrayal, but with a subtle shift in his gaze. The same eyes that once looked at her with reverence now carry a trace of unease, a silent plea for her to return to being the version he could understand. The projection is beginning to crack. For a man who has built his identity upon control of his image, his emotions, his surroundings, the moment that control slips, the psyche begins to fracture. Jung called this enantiodromia, the turning of a thing into its opposite. The strength he once wore like armor becomes the very weight that drowns him. Her silence, once alluring, now feels cruel. Her independence, once magnetic, now feels like rejection. He cannot understand why her peace agitates him so deeply, why her calm feels like a mirror to his chaos. In the beginning, he mistook her stillness for softness. He believed that her emotional depth would bend to his will, that her understanding nature would always meet his need. But she does not chase him when he withdraws. She does not soothe him when he grows distant. She does not perform the emotional rescue his mother once did, or the caretaking his past lovers offered freely. And in that void, in the space where her validation used to live, he begins to unravel. It is here that the real work of the psyche begins. When a man can no longer project his unlived self outward, he is forced to face the emptiness within. But that confrontation feels unbearable to one who has not yet met his shadow. So he fights it, not directly, but through her. He begins to test her boundaries. He withdraws his affection, measures her reaction, and searches for evidence that she feels his absence. When she doesn't flinch, when she doesn't chase, the quiet rage beneath his surface starts to stir. Because to the ego, indifference feels like annihilation. He begins to weaponize words he once used to praise her. You're too independent. You never let anyone in. You act like you don't need anyone. And perhaps she doesn't, not in the way he wants her to. He wants her dependence, not her devotion. He wants her validation, not her awareness. He wants her to reflect his importance, not his insecurity. But she knows the difference. She has learned that love rooted in need always decays into control. So she lets his storms pass. She doesn't explain, doesn't defend, doesn't fix. Her restraint is not passive, it is precise. It is the act of refusing to mother a man through his own immaturity. Yet her quietness only amplifies the noise in his mind. He begins to replay every moment, searching for proof that she has changed, that she no longer cares, that she is at fault for the ache he cannot name. He does not realize he is staring into the mirror of his own projections, seeing only what he brought to the reflection. This is the psychological tension where many relationships crumble, when the illusion of union collides with the truth of individuality. In Jungian terms, this is the confrontation with the shadow. Her presence, once a balm, now feels like exposure. She does not hide from his moods, but she does not absorb them either. And her refusal to engage with his emotional volatility feels like abandonment. He cannot see that she is offering him the greatest gift the feminine can give, the chance to meet himself without distraction. But the ego resists awakening as it resists death. So he clings harder. He texts more but says less. He oscillates between confessing love and creating distance, between wanting to possess her and wanting to punish her for the feelings she evokes. She senses his confusion, feels the tremor in his voice, the subtle pleading beneath his control. And in that moment, compassion flickers within her, but she knows. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-betrayal. So she stands still. She watches him reach for her, not from love, but from fear. Fear of the emptiness her silence reveals. Fear of what he becomes without her reflection to sustain his illusion of self. He starts to confuse attachment for connection. His desire for union morphs into possession. He begins to call it passion, chemistry, fate. But in truth, It is addiction to her reflection of his own worth. He tries to evoke the woman he once idealized. He recalls her laughter, her warmth, the way she made him feel seen. He tries to resurrect her through memory, as if the image he loved could be conjured back to life. But she has changed, or rather, she has become more of herself. She has peeled away the layers of performance, of pleasing, of making herself smaller to fit someone's comfort. The more she stands in her authenticity, the less she fits into his fantasy. And so he begins to grieve, not the woman before him, but the illusion he projected onto her. This is the fracture point, the moment when love must evolve or perish. He stands before her, wounded and raw, yet too proud to admit it. He accuses her of emotional distance, of not trying, of not caring. He asks her to explain herself, to validate his pain, to reassure him that he is still seen. But she offers him only truth. "I can't be what you imagine me to be," she says softly. "I can only be what I am." Her words fall like glass, sharp, fragile, and clear. He looks at her, unable to comprehend. He cannot grasp that she is not withholding affection. She is withholding illusion. Her truth threatens everything his ego depends on. Because if she is not the dream he created, then he must face the nightmare he avoided, the emptiness within. And so his frustration turns inward. He starts to question himself, not just as a lover, but as a man. His certainty dissolves into confusion. His confidence fractures into self-doubt. He feels small in her presence, not because she diminishes him, but because she reflects how little of himself he has truly met. His pride tells him to leave, to find another mirror, one more pliant, more forgiving, more easily fooled. But something keeps him bound. Something deeper than desire, older than love. It is the soul's instinct for wholeness. The psyche does not seek comfort, it seeks integration. And to integrate, one must first fracture. So he stays, not knowing why. Drawn not by pleasure, but by pain. Pulled not by lust, but by the ache of recognition. Every silence between them becomes sacred, a crucible where his false self begins to burn. He cannot dominate this woman. He cannot seduce her into softness. Her power is not in submission but in presence. And that presence dismantles him. He begins to see flashes of his shadow, the jealousy he hides beneath jokes, the fear beneath his arrogance, the boy within the man who still aches to be loved without condition. And slowly, painfully, the illusion begins to die. The reflection he once adored no longer flatters him, it exposes him. He tries to escape it, to drown it out with distractions, with noise, with other faces. But every new reflection feels hollow, distorted. None of them hold the same depth, the same unbearable truth. Because once a man has met the woman who mirrors his soul, no imitation can satisfy him again. He returns to her, not in body but in thought. Her absence becomes a haunting. Her silence echoes louder than any word she ever spoke. He begins to understand at last that her detachment is not cruelty. It is grace. The feminine in her highest form does not destroy. She reveals. She stands like a mirror before the unconscious, offering him a choice, to awaken or to remain broken. And though he may resist, fight, deny, the reflection remains. It waits for him in every failed attempt to love, in every restless night, in every moment of shame and longing. It waits for him in the silence between his words. Because the mirror, once seen, cannot be unseen. And somewhere in that unbearable truth, the fracture deepens, not to punish, but to open. For it is through the breaking that the light begins to enter. There comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when something inside her simply exhales. Not in defeat, but in release. It is not anger that moves her now. Not sorrow, not longing. It is the strange peace that arrives when you finally stop explaining yourself to someone who is not ready to hear. The moment when you stop trying to translate your depth into a language built for ego. And in that quiet, she begins to step back. At first, it is subtle, a softness withdrawn from her tone, a warmth no longer extended, an availability once taken for granted that has now dissolved into mystery. The conversations that once stretched into the night now fade into silence. The energy she once poured into understanding him she now turns inward, into her own reflection, her own becoming. She doesn't announce it. She doesn't declare that she's leaving. She simply begins to disappear from the places where her soul is no longer met. To him, this shift feels like abandonment. He senses it before he can name it, that faint chill in her presence, like the air before a storm that never comes. He reaches out, testing the waters, but the old responses aren't there. Her laughter, once effortless, now feels measured. Her eyes, once filled with curiosity, now gaze at him with quiet compassion, the kind one gives to someone who has yet to meet themselves. And this, for him, is unbearable. Because her withdrawal does not punish him, it reveals him. He begins to feel the full weight of the silence he once ignored. He hears his own emptiness echoing back. The texts unanswered, the invitations declined, the emotional distance, they are not weapons. They are mirrors. He realizes too late that her absence was not sudden. It was cumulative, born of the countless moments he did not listen, the countless times he mistook her composure for coldness, her independence for indifference. Now, she no longer plays the mirror for his fantasies. She has turned it toward herself. This is the feminine's sacred turning point, the moment she chooses self-integration over emotional survival. In Jungian terms, she begins the process of individuation, the return to her wholeness, independent of projection. She recognizes that she was never meant to be the container for his unhealed parts, nor the stage for his awakening. She was only ever meant to reflect what needed to be seen. Her detachment is not rebellion. It is awareness. She begins to move differently, slower, more deliberate. She reclaims her mornings, her solitude, her rituals. She reads the books she set aside, listens to the music she once silenced beneath his noise. She rediscovers the rhythm of her own breathing. And with every moment of quiet, she feels herself returning, piece by piece, from the places she gave herself away. Meanwhile, he stands before the ruins of his illusion. For the first time, he must face the space she left behind, not as absence, but as mirror. The reflection he once saw in her eyes is gone, and what remains is himself, stripped of fantasy, stripped of validation. He feels the tremor of loss, but beneath it, something deeper stirs, the faint, almost imperceptible pulse of truth. He begins to see that the love he thought he had for her was not love at all, but recognition. She was the voice of his own forgotten soul, calling him home through her presence. Now, with her silence, he is forced to listen, not to her, but to himself. This is the descent, the alchemical nigredo, the blackening phase of transformation when the old identity burns away. His ego resists, clawing at the remnants of what was, but the deeper self knows, the only way forward is through surrender. In the sleepless hours of night, he replays everything. Every moment he dismissed her intuition, every time he mocked her sensitivity, every silence he filled with pride instead of apology. He begins to see how his fear of vulnerability disguised itself as control, how his arrogance was only armor for the boy who once felt unseen. He realizes now that he never truly met her, because he had not yet met himself. And that realization breaks something open inside him. The reflection that once shattered his pride now begins to guide him toward humility. He begins to feel what he has spent years avoiding: grief, tenderness, longing, regret. He cries in silence, not for her, but for the man he could not be when she stood before him. This is the beginning of his awakening. But transformation is not instant. It is slow, jagged, merciless. He tries to reach out again, not from ego this time, but from something pure. He wants to apologize, to understand, to see her not as a projection but as a person. But she has already crossed the invisible threshold, from emotional entanglement to spiritual clarity. She responds gently, but the energy has changed. There is kindness, but no attachment, warmth, but no longing. Her voice no longer trembles. Her eyes no longer seek approval. She listens, but she does not absorb. She cares, but she does not carry. And that, more than anything, teaches him what love truly is. He sees now that love is not the merging of two halves, it is the meeting of two wholes. And he was never whole, not yet. The silence between them becomes sacred again, but this time, it belongs to her. He begins to see her detachment not as rejection, but as mastery. She is no longer the woman who mirrors him, she is the woman who mirrors herself. And in watching her, he learns something he could not learn in union, that love without ownership, connection without control, presence without demand, this is the true form of the feminine. But for now, he cannot stay close to it. It is too pure, too confronting. He must first descend deeper into the cavern of his own psyche to meet the parts of him he abandoned long before she arrived. He must learn to mother his own wounds, to become the container he once sought in her. He must make peace with the boy inside him who equated love with rescue. And she must continue walking her path. For her, the withdrawal was not an ending, it was a return. The return to her boundaries, her power, her stillness. She no longer seeks to be understood. She no longer offers explanations to those who hear through the filter of their fear. She no longer performs softness to prove she is safe. Her silence now is not the silence of suppression, it is the silence of sovereignty. In that stillness, she realizes that her worth was never measured by his recognition, her depth never diminished by his inability to meet it. She was never too much, never too cold, never too distant. She was simply too real for a man still hiding from himself. And so, she walks away, not out of pride, but out of truth. She knows that to stay would be to betray the part of her that has already evolved beyond the illusion. She knows that his love, though genuine in its ache, was still rooted in projection. And she cannot live as someone's reflection when she has already become her own light. He watches her leave, silent, motionless, powerless to stop her. Not because she is punishing him, but because he finally understands. Love cannot be possessed. Her absence is not an act of cruelty. It is the echo of a lesson the universe gives to every soul that seeks wholeness, that no one outside of you can complete what you refuse to face within. As her footsteps fade, he feels the air shift, as though something sacred has passed through him. The pain remains, yes, but it is no longer chaos. It is clarity. He will think of her often, not as the woman he lost, but as the mirror that once showed him everything he needed to find. And in time, perhaps, he will thank her. Because the withdrawal of the feminine is never truly an ending. It is the initiation, the threshold between illusion and awakening, between desire and consciousness. It is the point at which the soul whispers, "Now you see." Time softens everything, even the echo of heartbreak. But not all wounds are meant to disappear. Some are meant to remain, faint, glimmering reminders of what was once raw and holy. He carries her absence like a relic. Not a burden, but a mirror now turned inward. The ache that once drove him toward her has become the teacher that drives him toward himself. For the first time in years, he sits alone without reaching for distraction. He allows silence to fill the room. He breathes into it. He listens. And in that stillness, he begins to understand what she had been showing him all along. It was never about her, not entirely. It was about what she awakened. The feminine, in her true form, is not here to soothe a man's ego or fulfill his fantasy. She is here to illuminate what is hidden, to draw him, unwillingly if she must, toward his own wholeness. Her presence calls forth the parts of him he buried to survive. The tenderness, the vulnerability, the sensitivity he was told to kill in the name of manhood. When she walked away, those parts had nowhere left to hide. Now he faces them, trembling, uncertain, but alive. He begins to meet the boy who once learned that love must be earned. The young man who mistook performance for power. The lover who thought control was protection. He sits with them all, one by one, learning to hold what he once disowned. The anima within, that quiet, intuitive feminine voice, begins to whisper again. For the first time, he listens. And as he listens, something shifts. He begins to understand that love is not possession, but perception. That what he sought in her was not completion, but reflection. He does not reach for her anymore. He reaches for the truth she revealed. This is how the masculine begins to awaken, not through victory, but through surrender. Not through conquest, but through consciousness. He starts to notice the world differently. The sound of rain no longer irritates him, it soothes. He notices the way light moves through a room, the way small things carry meaning. He becomes less reactive, more aware. He speaks less but with greater weight. The reflection that once broke him now humbles him. And somewhere, miles away, perhaps in another city, another chapter of her own becoming, she feels it. Because when two souls meet through the mirror of truth, their growth is never separate. She too has changed. Since her withdrawal, her life has taken on a new rhythm, not one defined by absence, but by presence. The energy she once spent managing his emotions has been reabsorbed into her creativity, her work, her stillness. She no longer seeks to be understood. She has learned to be witnessed by her own consciousness. Her solitude does not feel lonely anymore. It feels sacred, like standing inside her own cathedral. She understands now that the love she offered was never wasted. It was alchemy. Her presence was the fire that burned away illusion, his and her own. Because she, too, had once mistaken reflection for connection. She, too, once thought her depth could save someone unwilling to swim. But now she knows, the feminine does not heal by carrying, she heals by seeing. And in seeing, she releases. Her heart, once so eager to give, now beats to a calmer rhythm. She no longer gives love to prove her value, she gives it because she is love. That distinction changes everything. The world begins to respond to her differently. Opportunities appear, not as distractions, but as extensions of her authenticity. People are drawn to her calm. Her energy no longer leaks through need, it radiates through knowing. There are moments when memories of him still drift through her mind. A song, a scent, the memory of a half-smile across the table. But the pain no longer pierces. It simply passes, like wind through open windows. Because she does not regret loving him. She only regrets the moments she doubted herself in the process. He was never her ending, only her mirror. And she, in her quiet power, was his. They will meet again, perhaps, in passing, two souls who once burned too brightly to last. He will look at her and feel that familiar tremor, the silent recognition that she was the threshold between who he was and who he became. She will smile not from longing, but from gratitude, because some people arrive not to stay, but to awaken. And awakening, once begun, cannot be undone. The woman who walks away in silence does not vanish. She becomes myth, not the fantasy of his projection, but the embodiment of his becoming. Every woman he meets after her carries traces of that lesson, the reflection of truth she once held so clearly. And every woman she becomes after him carries traces of what she learned, that power and softness are not opposites, but twin flames, that love is not submission, but resonance, that the only real connection begins when illusion ends. She no longer seeks mirrors in others. She has become her own. And he, if he is brave, will someday do the same. Because when a man loses the woman who reflected his soul, he is given the rarest gift, the invitation to meet himself. That is the true purpose of heartbreak, not to punish, but to purify. Not to destroy, but to awaken. In the quiet aftermath, the world continues its slow turning. The sky darkens. The city lights flicker. Somewhere, in separate rooms, they both breathe, steady, grounded, whole. Two souls once bound by projection now liberated by truth. And though they may never speak again, something eternal connects them, not love in the romantic sense, but recognition. That she was the mirror that taught him to see, and he was the reflection that taught her to stay true. The cycle completes itself. The projection dissolves. The shadow integrates. The anima and animus find their balance, no longer enemies, but allies in the work of wholeness. And from that balance, something sacred is born, a consciousness that loves without fear, desires without demand, connects without control. This is what Jung called individuation, the soul remembering itself. It begins with reflection. It deepens with fracture. It matures with withdrawal. And it ends, always, in liberation. Because the woman who walks away in silence isn't weak. She simply sees more.